She defied the judge, challenged the law, and even fought the bailiff, but nothing could prepare her for the sentence that shattered her world. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras lowered but ready. A few whispered among themselves, already crafting headlines before the hearing even began. At the front, attorneys shuffled through thick files, murmuring last-minute strategies. The moment everyone was waiting for had arrived. Sloane Wexley strode in, not as a woman on trial, but as a woman who owned the room. Tall, effortlessly poised, and dressed in a crisp, tailored white suit that likely cost more than the annual salary of half the people present. She moved with the assurance of someone who had never heard the word no in her life. She didn't glance at the rows of spectators watching her every move. She didn't acknowledge the legal team seated at her table, the ones she'd paid handsomely to clean up the mess she still refused to admit was her fault. And she certainly didn't seem fazed by the weight of the charges against her: securities fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. As she settled into her seat, she let out a quiet exhale, barely masking her irritation. This was an inconvenience, nothing more. A temporary PR nightmare that would be forgotten within months, drowned out by the next corporate scandal. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff stepped forward. His voice, firm but practiced, echoed through the chamber. All rise for the Honorable Judge Dorian Langston. The room shifted. Chairs scraped against the polished floors as the crowd obeyed. Even Sloane's own attorneys pushed themselves up, some hesitating when they realized she hadn't moved an inch. She remained seated, one leg crossed over the other, perfectly manicured fingers resting against her knee. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes, as if she were watching a test play out in real time, waiting to see who would dare to challenge her. The murmurs started immediately, a few gasps, a sharp intake of breath from someone near the front. The reporters weren't whispering anymore. Judge Langston stepped onto the bench, adjusting his robe with practiced ease. He was a man of few wasted words and even fewer wasted glances. At 57, he had presided over some of the most complex cases in the country, earning a reputation for his sharp intellect, unwavering composure, and an intolerance for theatrics. He didn't need theatrics. His presence alone commanded the room. For a moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her. The silence dragged, stretching so long that even the court stenographer glanced up, sensing something unusual was happening. Then, in a voice that was steady but firm, Judge Langston spoke. "Miss Wexley, this court follows standard procedure. I expect you to do the same." Sloane's lips curled slightly, not a smile, something closer to a smirk. She leaned back, exuding the kind of ease that only comes from absolute confidence. "I stand for people I respect, Your Honor." The words landed like a slap across the room. Someone audibly inhaled. One of her attorneys, a younger man with nervous hands, instinctively turned toward her, his face tightening as if he were about to say something, then thought better of it. Judge Langston, to his credit, didn't flinch. If her words affected him, he didn't show it. "That is your choice," he said simply. Then he turned his attention to the prosecution. Just like that, the moment passed. But the tension didn't. Sloane expected more, expected outrage, expected a reaction. But instead she was met with something worse: indifference. The judge had acknowledged her defiance and dismissed it in the same breath. He hadn't played into her game, hadn't scolded her, hadn't done anything to make her feel as important as she believed herself to be. It was a miscalculation on her part. and miscalculations weren't something Sloane Wexley was used to. But she wasn't done yet, and the next move she made would send a shockwave through the courtroom. The prosecution wasted no time. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to proceed." Judge Langston gave a slight nod. "Proceed." Assistant District Attorney Troy Benson stood, buttoning his suit jacket with measured precision. He was a man who had built his career on tearing down the powerful, and today his focus was locked on Sloane Wexley. "The case against Ms. Wexley is clear. The evidence we will present demonstrates beyond any doubt that she engaged in willful fraud, knowingly misleading investors, fabricating numbers, and obstructing investigations into her company's financial misconduct." Sloane barely reacted. She sat with the same unreadable expression, the same effortless confidence, as if Benson were describing the weather and not listing offenses that could put her behind bars for decades. Her lead attorney, Marshall Grayson, rose next. He was an expensive fixer, one of those lawyers whose name alone sent a message, "I don't lose." He adjusted his cuffs before speaking, his voice smooth, controlled. "Your Honor, my client is a target not because she's guilty, but because she's successful. The prosecution is desperate for a win. They want a high-profile takedown to justify their budget. That's what this is about." Sloane allowed herself a slight approving nod. "That's more like it." But Judge Langston didn't react. He simply turned toward Benson. "Call your first witness." The prosecution's first witness was Daniel Cho, a former financial officer at Wexley Technologies. As he took the stand, he barely looked at Sloane. When he did, it was fleeting, something between nervousness and quiet resentment. Benson wasted no time. "Mr. Cho, during your time at Wexley Technologies, were you instructed to alter financial reports?" Cho hesitated. His fingers twitched against his lap. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sloane exhaled, barely masking her irritation. This was already going exactly as she expected, the parade of so-called whistleblowers eager to paint her as the villain. "And who gave you that instruction?" Benson pressed. Cho swallowed. "Ms. Wexley." This time the reaction was louder. One of the reporters scribbled something furiously, the click of their pen punctuating the heavy silence. Sloane let out a quiet laugh, a tiny, dismissive scoff just loud enough to be heard. It was the kind of laugh that said, "This is ridiculous, and I refuse to take it seriously." Judge Langston's gaze flickered toward her, but before he could say anything, she did something no one expected. She stood. Her chair scraped against the polished floor, cutting through the tension like a blade. Marshall Grayson stiffened. He turned toward her, his lips barely parting as if he wanted to say, "Sit down," but knew better than to try. The courtroom fell into a strange, unnatural silence. Sloane didn't address the judge, didn't look at her lawyers. She turned her attention straight to Daniel Cho. "Tell me, Daniel," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something dangerous. "When exactly did I instruct you to do this?" Cho's throat bobbed. "Miss Weasley? No, really," she continued, tilting her head. "Was it in an email, a phone call, a memo? Or is this just another case of an underqualified employee looking for an excuse?" Gasps rippled through the room. Benson stepped forward immediately. "Your Honor." Judge Langston lifted a hand. "Miss Weasley, sit down." She didn't. Instead, she folded her arms. "I have a right to confront my accuser." Marshall Grayson inhaled sharply. This was bad, very bad. Judge Langston's stare was measured, unreadable. "You have a right to a defense, Miss Weasley. You do not have the right to disrupt my courtroom." Sloane's smirk returned, just a flicker of it. "Disrupt? I'm just asking a question." He's lying. The tension was unbearable now. Every eye in the room bounced between Sloane and the judge, waiting for what would happen next. Judge Langston leaned forward slightly. "This is my last warning. Sit down." But Sloane Wexley didn't take orders. Not from board members, not from regulators, and certainly not from a judge. What she did next would send the courtroom into chaos. Sloane's pulse was steady, her breath even, but there was something simmering beneath the surface, a flicker of frustration, a whisper of something she wouldn't name. She wasn't used to being controlled, and she certainly wasn't used to being dismissed. She exhaled slowly. Then, without warning, she turned her back on the judge. Gasps rang out across the room. One of her attorneys stiffened so suddenly that his chair nearly toppled. The stenographer froze, fingers hovering above the keyboard. No defendant ever turned their back on a federal judge. It was an unspoken rule, an acknowledgement that in this space, authority belonged to the bench. But Sloane Wexley, she didn't recognize authority she didn't respect. Judge Langston didn't move. His expression didn't change. "Face this court, Miss Weasley." Sloane didn't. Instead, she reached for the glass of water on the table, lifted it to her lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Miss Weasley. Still, she didn't turn. Her legal team looked horrified. One of her junior attorneys, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white, leaned in as if he were about to whisper something. But he never got the chance, because Judge Langston's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Bailiff!" A ripple of tension crashed over the room, and then it happened. The bailiff stepped forward, a large man, broad shoulders squared, voice steady. "Ma'am, I need you to turn and face the judge." Sloane didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge him at all. Her entire posture was a message. "I don't answer to you." The air in the courtroom shifted. The spectators could feel it now. Something more than tension, more than arrogance. Defiance. Pure, reckless defiance. And then, without a word, the bailiff reached for her arm. The moment his hand touched her, everything exploded. Sloane Wexley, billionaire, corporate queen, untouchable icon, snapped. She yanked her arm away with a sharp, violent jerk, twisting out of the bailiff's grasp. The movement sent her water glass crashing to the floor, shattering on impact. Someone screamed. Papers rustled. Attorneys jumped to their feet. A security officer moved forward, hand hovering near his belt. Sloane's breathing was heavier now, her shoulders rising and falling. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not arrogance, not amusement. Pure, uncontrolled rage. Judge Langston exhaled slowly, his fingers laced together but his gaze unwavering. "Miss Weasley, you've just made a very costly mistake." Her jaw clenched, her nails dug into her palm. And for the first time since stepping into that courtroom, Sloane realized she wasn't in control. Not anymore. Because the consequences of her actions had just begun. The room was frozen. Sloane Wexley, the woman who had dominated boardrooms, dismantled rivals and dictated the rules of her own empire, was now standing in the middle of a courtroom, facing the one thing she couldn't manipulate: consequences. She knew how to wield power, money, influence, connections. But none of those things mattered here. Judge Langston leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, unshaken. "Miss Weasley, this court is not your boardroom. Your wealth, your status, none of it changes the fact that in this space you are a defendant, and you will be treated as one." Sloane inhaled through her nose. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing into her. The reporters were scribbling furiously, some already typing out headlines. Her legal team sat stiff, staring at her like she had just set her own defense on fire. She had to regain control. She adjusted her jacket, forcing a slow breath. Then, with the same practiced arrogance she'd carried all her life, she rolled her shoulders back and lifted her chin. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, voice smooth, "I wasn't resisting. I was simply uncomfortable with being grabbed." Judge Langston's stare didn't waver. "You refused to comply with a direct order from this court." "I didn't refuse," she countered, a sly smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "I just didn't respond in the time you wanted." A dangerous silence followed. And then Judge Langston picked up his gavel. A single, controlled knock against the bench. "Bailiff." The bailiff stepped forward again, more deliberate this time. "Miss Wexley, I am holding you in contempt of court." It hit like a punch. Even her attorneys, seasoned professionals used to cleaning up disasters, looked like they had been gut-punched. One of them, the junior associate who had barely spoken since the trial began, covered his mouth like he had just witnessed a car crash. Sloane blinked. Contempt. She'd heard the word before. She knew what it meant, but it had never applied to her until now. "Are you serious?" Her voice was quieter this time, controlled but laced with something foreign, uncertainty. Judge Langston's expression remained unreadable. "You are to be taken into custody for the remainder of today's proceedings. Your attorneys may request a motion for release after court adjourns." A ripple of shock tore through the crowd. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. One woman, seated near the back, whispered, "Oh my God!" Sloane's hands curled into fists. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She wasn't supposed to be losing. But when the bailiff stepped behind her, when she felt the firm, undeniable grip of control being stripped from her hands, something inside her cracked. She whirled around. "You can't be serious!" But Judge Langston was already moving on. He wasn't looking at her anymore. To him, she was no longer the center of the universe. And for the first time in her life, Sloane Wexley had to face a reality she wasn't prepared for. She was no longer untouchable. The metallic click of handcuffs wasn't just a sound. It was a shift in power. Sloane's arms were pulled behind her back, wrists locked in cold steel. And for the first time since she had entered that courtroom, she felt it. Control slipping through her fingers. The cameras caught everything. Reporters pushed closer, their lenses trained on the woman who once sat atop the tech world, now reduced to a defendant in cuffs. Her attorneys were already scrambling. Marshal Grayson stepped forward, voice sharp and urgent. "Your Honor, we request an immediate reversal of the contempt order." Miss Wexley was simply— Judge Langston barely glanced up. "Denied." Sloane clenched her jaw. Her breath was tight in her chest, not out of fear, out of rage. She had been in boardrooms with kings and presidents. She had negotiated billion-dollar deals in high-rise offices that judges like Langston could never step foot in. And now she was standing here in handcuffs, like a criminal. The bailiff moved to guide her, toward a holding cell. But before he could, Sloane Wexley did something no one expected. She turned, looked directly at Judge Langston, and spoke. "Tell me something, Judge," she said, her voice carrying across the dead, silent courtroom. "Would you have done this if I weren't who I am?" The question hung in the air. It was deliberate, a trap, a move she had used countless times. Force the opposition to question their own authority, plant the idea of bias, make them defensive. A dangerous gamble. But Judge Langston didn't take the bait. He let the silence sit just long enough to remind her who controlled this space. Then, with a calm that was far more powerful than any outburst could ever be, he spoke. "Miss Wexley, you are standing before this court not because of who you are, but because of what you have done. A single sentence, one that landed heavier than anything she had thrown at him, because it was the truth." Sloane felt her stomach twist. For the first time, she saw something in Judge Langston's eyes that she hadn't noticed before. Not anger, not even authority, but certainty. This wasn't a man trying to prove a point. This was a man who had already won. And Sloane Wexley, for all her wealth, for all her brilliance, had no way to stop it. Her lips parted slightly, as if to fire back, as if to claw back any amount of control. But no words came, because deep down she knew this wasn't a game she could win. The bailiff stepped forward. "Let's go." And just like that, the trial was no longer about power. It was about what happens when power means nothing. Sloane sat in the defendant's chair, wrists free from cuffs now, but the weight of the past few days was heavier than steel. The contempt charge had delayed proceedings, but it hadn't stopped them. If anything, it had given the prosecution more ammunition, proof that Sloane Wexley believed she was above the law. Her legal team had worked around the clock. Scrambling to undo the damage she had done to herself, they argued that the case was overblown, that the evidence was circumstantial, that no direct orders could be tied to her. But the truth was simple. The jury didn't like her. It wasn't just the fraud. It wasn't just the financial deception. It was her. She had spent years building an empire on arrogance. She had bulldozed competition, made enemies of regulators, and treated everyone who challenged her as beneath her. And now it had caught up to her. The jury had deliberated for less than 7 hours. That wasn't a good sign. Judge Langston entered the courtroom for the final time in this case. The room stood. This time, Sloane stood too, not out of respect, not because she wanted to, but because she knew better now. The jury foreman rose, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice. In the case of the United States versus Sloane Wexley, we find the defendant. The pause was excruciating. Guilty on all counts. Silence. Then a wave of hushed murmurs. A sharp breath from one of her attorneys. A rustle of movement from the press as they scribbled out their headlines. Sloane didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react, because this wasn't supposed to happen. She had always assumed she'd walk away, maybe a fine, maybe a few public apologies. A strategic reinvention with the help of PR firms, not this. Her mind barely registered Judge Langston's voice as he addressed the court. Given the severity of these crimes and the clear and deliberate efforts to mislead investors and regulatory bodies, this court finds it appropriate to impose the following sentence. He listed the charges, the damages, the sentences that would run consecutively. A total of 18 years. 18 years. She felt distant from her own body. Her attorneys were already speaking, already filing motions, requesting appeals. But none of it mattered. She was going to prison. Not a white-collar resort where billionaires did time with private chefs and tennis courts. Federal prison. Sloane Wexley, who had once dictated the future of technology, who had sat on magazine covers as a symbol of power and success, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Judge Langston's gaze met hers one last time, and though his face remained calm, his message was clear. Power is meaningless when you think you're above consequence. The bailiff stepped forward again, and this time Sloane didn't resist, because for the first time in her life, she understood something she never had before. She had lost. The story of Sloane Wexley wasn't just about fraud. It was about what happens when arrogance blinds you to reality. when you believe you're untouchable, when you think rules are for other people. Power doesn't protect you forever, not when you abuse it. And in the end, even the mightiest fall. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Sloane got what she deserved, or was the punishment too harsh?